Iron Man, 1994 to 1996. In the mid-90s, Marvel brought its iconic hero to the small screen with the Iron Man animated series. Marvel Films Animation developed the series, which was part of the Marvel Action Hour, a syndicated television slot featuring animated versions of Marvel characters. The program aired alongside other Marvel series, such as Fantastic Four for 2 seasons, which included 26 episodes. The episodes that followed featured a preview from Stan Lee himself, which increased their appeal to comic book lovers. This beloved show became a distinctive aspect of the 1990s cartoon scene, with its combination of action, heroic storytelling, and futuristic technology, even if it was not as well known as other Marvel programs such as X-Men or Spider-Man. Join us as we look back at this exciting series that introduced a new generation of fans to Iron Man years before the Marvel Cinematic Universe made him an iconic figure. Also, for the love of Iron Man, if you like our content, do hit the like and subscribe button, as it would make you the real superheroes for us. Season 1, 1994, Episode 1, And the Sea Shall Give Up Its Dead. Within a frigid swamp, an installation is buried by snow as an aging admiral reviews signals from a restricted area and concludes that it is a Russian sub. However, another member, a technician, suggests it isn't a Russian submarine but something else. Meanwhile, aboard a Russian nuclear submarine, an intruder is detected. The captain and an officer confront a blonde woman examining a glowing cube. Hypnotizing the men, she declares the crew will become an undead army serving the Mandarin within a year. This series introduced the Mandarin as a recurring villain. Interestingly, the character's design and abilities in the show were influenced by his original comic book appearance, but were also updated to fit the animated world of that era. She attaches a device to the cube, escapes through a laser-cut hole in the hull, and swims away as seawater floods the sub. The scene shifts, and a man named Tony Stark undergoes a rigorous physical therapy session at a spa. His instructor, Veronica, orders him to paddle his legs faster against the water, but unfortunately in the process, he splashes water at Jim, aka War Machine. He obviously grumbles like any of us would when splashed with water. Anyhow, suddenly alarms sound as a tornado rushes toward them, causing havoc. As it turns out, the tornado was a man named Whirlwind, who was aided by someone named Dread Knight to launch an attack and steal a microchip before retreating. Even though they fail to get it, Tony realizes this isn't the Mandarin's usual style and vows to investigate. Another woman in a spider outfit tells them that the culprits were trying to break into Stark's armory. In the Mandarin's lair, the villain, Mandarin, unveils his plan to use the stolen microchip to adjust the device planted on the submarine, transforming its crew into radioactive zombies. He is a steadfast person who is ready to wait for even years if it means that he gets to destroy Tony Stark. A year goes by after the initial attack, which makes Jim think that their nemesis has given up, but Tony thinks it is the calm before the storm. Meanwhile, the White House requests Stark Enterprises' help with a mysterious incident involving the missing submarine Prometheus. The Russian nuclear sub went missing somewhere off the coast of Scotland and carries something that could be heavily destructive, since any ship that passes near it is sprayed with something dangerous. Meanwhile, a woman had been eavesdropping on the conversation. And wait, she was none other than Hypnotia. She had been accompanied by one of Mandarin's henchmen, Modok, who quickly flies back to his boss to tell the story to him. However, Mandarin thinks that this might be the opportunity he has been looking for and assembles Dreadnought, Whirlwind, and Grey Gargoyle to take part in the mission to confront Tony Stark and his allies on Prometheus. Back at Stark Enterprises, Tony Stark finds a connection between the sub and his armory break-in. Suspicious, Tony suits up as Iron Man and flies to investigate, accompanied by Irving, his refit drone. However, he leaves Jim and the spider-costumed woman along with another woman back at his armory, and they watch Tony through computer screens. After a brief interruption, they connect back with Tony to find he is fast approaching the Scottish coast. He dives in with the help of Irving, and once underwater, Iron Man finds the Prometheus. However, he is suddenly ambushed by the Mandarin's forces. He is buried under rubble and attacked by Grey Gargoyle and Whirlwind. The group back at the armory watches the events unfold and decides it is time to suit up. Thus, War Machine and allies including Sentry and the spider-costumed woman, arrive to rescue Iron Man. Meanwhile, Fin Fang Foom, a dragon summoned by the Mandarin, further injures Iron Man, sending him into a deep chasm, but his friends fatefully save him from eternal doom. Iron Man is revived at Stark's armory and deduces that Mandarin's plot involves a year-long plan to weaponize the Prometheus crew. At the Hammer Tunnel in London, zombies emerge from the ocean, advancing toward the city. The Mandarin activates the device, transforming the Prometheus crew into unstoppable radioactive zombies. They march toward the surface, promising havoc, and Tony realizes if they do not stop them, the radiation will threaten millions. It would also give Mandarin an undead battalion. Thus, Iron Man's team engages the zombie horde at the tunnel entrance, but their numbers grow. Using strategic blasts, Iron Man collapses parts of the tunnel, slowing their advance. In desperation, he dives underwater to destroy the tunnel from within, flooding it and neutralizing many zombies. Seeing the battle on screen, Mandarin laments the failure of their plan. However, Modok unveils a contingency plan, summoning the Titanium Man, a massive cybernetic villain. Mandarin is pleased, believing the tide has turned. Titanium Man arrives on Earth, overpowering Iron Man and War Machine in an initial confrontation. Though battered, the heroes resolve to stop him and the Mandarin's plot. Knowing the stakes involve global catastrophe, they bundle up the Titanium Man and hurl him into open space where it explodes mightily. Meanwhile, the crew of the Russian nuclear sub turns back to their normal self. As the dust settles, Iron Man and his team decide that the crew from the submarine were themselves victims of Mandarin's evil plan and thus should not be punished. Episode 2. Rejoice, I am Ultimo, thy deliverer. On a gloomy night, lightning illuminated the sky as waves crashed against jagged rocks. A crimson-hulled ship, Hammer Manta Ray, carefully navigated into the open ocean. Modok's mechanical voice echoed over the comms, and at the base of a towering cliff, steel doors groaned open. The ship slid inside, and as the sea gates slammed shut, the sound of draining water filled the dry dock. Meanwhile, inside the control room, Mandarin joined Modok and Justin Hammer, who were seated at consoles. The screen displayed the ship's massive cargo, a humanoid figure draped in ancient cloth. Apparently, Mandarin had found an extraterrestrial relic. After many ministrations by Mandarin, the robot remained lifeless. So Hammer, frustrated, suggested scrapping it. Two robotic welders approached, sparking to life as they worked. Suddenly, the giant's crimson eyes flared. It spoke in a booming voice, claiming its name was Ultimo. Mandarin, undeterred, demanded obedience, but Ultimo retaliated, blasting a hole in the facility wall. As storms raged outside, the towering robot vanished into the sea. Meanwhile, a luxurious yacht, Iron Maiden, sat anchored in a bustling harbour, its deck alive with a formal celebration. On the yacht, Tony Stark seamlessly conversed with a woman near the railing. However, soon, James Rhodes brought some interesting news to Tony about the satellite security picking up some unapproved feed from Baja California. As Tony watches the anomaly broadcast, the camera shifts to a desolate scene as a woman sprints for cover, narrowly avoiding one massive robot's footfall. Tony firmly thinks the robot is real, and in its background is the Sky Saucer. Tony thus decides to check on it and changes into his portable Iron Man suit. The scene shifts to a quiet desert town where two shepherds watch their flock by a fountain. The peace shatters as Ultimo stomps into view, dust swirling in its wake. From the Sky Saucer, Mandarin observes the robot and deduces that it must have some ulterior purpose. However, he plans to be the one controlling the gigantic robot. Thus, Mandarin tells Modok to bring the saucer closer. As it descends, he steps onto a platform, lowering the flashing template with a beam from his ring. Attaching it to Ultimo's skull, the robot halts and kneels. Obviously, Mandarin is feeling pretty triumphant about himself. However, his triumph is short-lived as Mandarin's gaze sharpens and latches onto the approaching figure of Iron Man. This time, though, he is determined to use Ultimo to fend off Iron Man, who finds himself up against a giant and formidable opponent. Struggling, Iron Man attempts to fly, but Ultimo strikes again. But instead of finishing the Iron Man off, Mandarin takes him with them to his palace. Meanwhile, Rhodey, Sentry, and the Spider-Woman realize that they haven't heard from Tony in a while and decide to follow up on the problem. Simultaneously, a broadcast alerts them of a gigantic robot in the vicinity of Baja California. Surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, the place they lost contact with Tony and concluded that he must be in trouble. Furthermore, Rhodey realized the gravity of the situation and informed his teammates that the area has a clandestine base for Stark Enterprises, and if the robot gets there, it would be catastrophic, to say the least. You can clearly see how the War Machine character in the animated series got a more prominent role as a supporting character than it had in the comics. At his behest, the group, thus, heads out to rescue Tony. Back at the Mandarin's lair, he tries to take off Iron Man's suit to know who is behind the mask, but finds that whoever is within is fighting against his cyber-rack mightily. Mandarin, though, is determined and dreams of stealing all of Tony's robots and selling them to profit from them, while also installing a chip that would render him its sole controller. Thus, under Mandarin's command, Ultimo is trying to get inside a bunker, the Stark Enterprises bunker. The War Machine and the other teammates attack the gigantic robot, but to no avail. He simply was too strong. Meanwhile, from the flying saucer, Modok gives out commands to destroy the group. However, due to some malfunctioning, the template that subdued the robot to their commands fell off, and Ultimo continued on his mission without interruption. Simultaneously, the group is left clueless as to why the robot stopped, but takes advantage of the situation to regroup and strategize. However, back on the flying saucer, while Tony still writhes in pain from the energy field, Mandarin goes mad with the desire to control whatever it is that has Ultimo's attention. Simultaneously, Tony Stark is still in a lot of pain when he is ultimately buried in rubble from an explosion. However, he is saved by Sentry, who finds him, but at the cost of his own exhaustion. Tony, now revitalized, carries Sentry back to his place where the others are gathered. They track the giant automaton, which is headed toward the Sacred Sands, and realize they've got to stop him soon. As the team rallies to stop it, they see beams of crimson light erupt from its eyes, triggering earthquakes and massive fissures. The team sprang into action, but Ultimo proved nearly indestructible. Meanwhile, in his lab, Iron Man worked with Scarlet Witch to decode Ultimo's alien systems. Iron Man and War Machine worked together to distract the robot. Their teamwork brought Hawkeye the opportunity to fire a precise arrow, activating the dimensional portal. Ultimo froze mid-attack, its crimson glow fading. In the aftermath, Spider-Woman ensured Ultimo's remains were secured before joining the festivities. Yet, as the door slid shut, a faint crimson glow returned to the robot's eyes, a chilling reminder that the battle might not be over. Episode 3, Data In, Chaos Out. An overwhelming military chaos is spreading through the world. Meanwhile, a news reporter goes on about how the dire situation is made even more difficult by a massive crash in the stock market which had caused havoc on the banking systems. However, it seems one person is profiting from the chaos and also has access to the supercomputer which holds information about worldwide trading. Seems fishy, doesn't it? Also, this intro is a subtle nod to the 1929 Wall Street crash. Anyhow, as the world is reeling in chaos, Mandarin is up to something again. It shouldn't really come as a surprise that he is the one causing all the chaos. Now should it? He actually aims to profit even more from the financial upheaval, but James Rhodes sticks up as a thorn in his path. Modok, though, promises to take care of the problem easily enough, using his external life form. Funny how Mandarin finds it repulsive. Meanwhile, Tony Stark is using his Iron Man armor remotely to drill for Zenebrium on a meteor, but due to certain instability, the meteor is on its way to explode. Unfortunately, though, the armor's leg is stuck, which makes escaping a little troublesome though. Everything pulls through at the last possible minute. Back at the armory though, Rhodes berates Tony for doing the remote test alone and comments mightily on his recklessness. Tony in turn justifies his actions by reminding how the government wants the Zenebrium for the fusion shielding, and since the material can only be mined on a handful of meteors before it inevitably explodes. Eventually, Tony gets a call from President Bill, who wants to confirm whether Tony has any hand in the current military panic. Surprised, Tony refutes it vigorously and promises to release his bank statements to prove that he isn't the sole benefactor of the crisis. Thus, Tony asks Rhodes to do as necessary. However, when Rhodes goes to gather the data, the mini Modok, or as he calls it, ELF, latches itself onto Rhodes, controlling him. It shows a hologram of Tony and manipulates him into thinking that Tony is behind the global military crisis and is benefiting from the resulting fiscal chaos. Meanwhile, Tony and Julia are trying to understand the situation of the satellites when Rhodes bursts in with officials to arrest Tony. He accuses his friend of committing the crime, while a disbelieving Julia demands proof of the baseless accusation. Tony, though, for his part, complied with the officers and went with them. Here, Tony's arresting agents most likely belong to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. However, they are never recognized as such. Later, the news of Tony Stark's arrest, the billionaire industrialist brought low, spread like wildfire among the public. Soon enough, Justin Hammer, another industrialist who is in cahoots with Mandarin, offers fake sympathy to the media. Meanwhile, Tony is bailed out of prison by Julia, who then accompanies Tony as he decides to launch another communication satellite. Julia comments how she never realizes that two people can undertake such a complicated task, but Tony assures her that he knows what he is attempting. However, Julia protests when Tony reveals he plans to mount the satellite in order to infiltrate Mandarin's spaceship. So, Tony suits up in his Iron Man costume and sneaks onto the communication satellite. As the Mandarin detects another satellite, he and Modok end up confused since, as per their knowledge, they had intercepted all of Stark Enterprise's satellites. Modok then suggests that it must be Tony's way of redeeming the chaos, and they decide to deal with it. Mandarin lets the satellite on board, but is shocked to find Tony inside. A quick confrontation ensues, which ends in Iron Man being cornered, as Modok calls on Rhodes to fend Iron Man off. Rhodes, who was still being controlled, assembled the group and they headed to where Iron Man is. Meanwhile, as Mandarin watches the crew approach, he berates Modok for his small-sightedness, since the crew would easily botch all his efforts. As predicted, the crew does help in rescuing Iron Man, but they soon notice War Machine is acting very differently. He is attacking Iron Man. The group corners Mandarin and Modok, but they escape anyhow, setting the spaceship on self-implode mode. The crew, along with Iron Man, help War Machine break free from his enthralled state just moments before the spaceship explodes. As Mandarin and Modok watch the explosion, they rejoice, thinking they've finally defeated Iron Man and his team, but their delusional bubble is soon deflated by the sight of the crew escaping. As to how they did that? Well, our genius industrialist shielded their ride with Zenebrium, of course. Episode 4, Silence My Companion, Death My Destination. In an open desert, Justin Hammer's group and Tony Stark's group are showcasing their latest models to a general who is looking for a tank worthy enough to guard their most important locations. As Justin gloats about the reliability of his group, James Rhodes simply shows them why Stark Enterprise is better. Thus, with a swift demonstration, the general gives out the contact to the Stark Enterprise. Rhodes promised that at least 10 Watchmen tanks would be delivered to them as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Justin Hammer is fuming with anger. However, it is soon revealed that even though Justin's anger is real, his defeat was fabricated. In reality, it was Mandarin's idea. Yes, who else? To make sure that the Stark Enterprise gets the contract. His master plan entails the tanks being slowly affected by a virus so that when the time comes, it will explode and leave every important base in the country vulnerable. A cunning plan indeed. Meanwhile, Tony Stark is using his Iron Man suit to traverse in virtual reality when apparently he is attacked by Dread Knight. However, when he asks Julia to look into it, she says that no one is there, though Tony insists otherwise. Later, when Tony returns after barely escaping death, he realizes that there must be some malfunctioning within his suit. The scene shifts, and we see Tony, Julia, and her daughter Rachel enjoying an evening hearing a great pianist, Van Cliburn, play. While Julia hopes her daughter would find the evening's events inspirational enough to start focusing more on her piano lessons, the exact opposite comes to pass. Rachel, like any teenager, thinks classical music is not worth the effort, especially since she can't use it in the future. The next day, as Julia is about to leave for work, Rachel grumbles about how she always does that. As Julia tries to explain, Rachel suddenly brushes it off and heads off to her piano lessons. However, before she can leave, her mother gives her a cassette with the recording of Van Cliburn. They say disaster often comes unannounced. And so it happens. As Rachel stepped out of her house, a strange woman who disguised herself as Rachel's friend invited her to go to the nearby arcade mall with her. Not realizing the danger she is about to get in, Rachel and the woman go to the arcade where the woman shows Rachel the brand new Rad game. Back in the 90s, the term rad often was considered as a popular street slang to describe something really cool. Anyhow, as Rachel plays the game, she soon realizes that she is getting late for her piano lessons. But before she can leave, the woman loses her fake get-up and tells Rachel to stay put until her boss permits her to leave. Unsurprisingly, Rachel's kidnapper is working for Justin Hammers, who demands the database of the Watchmen tanks in exchange for Rachel's release. However, Justin is obviously working for Mandarin, who hopes to get rid of Iron Man for real now. He sets up a trap, knowing Iron Man would come to rescue Rachel, and he'd use the opportunity to play his trump card. Back at the armory, Tony suits up in his Iron Man gear in order to save Rachel. However, Rhodes warns him that the suit is still vulnerable and might cause some hindrance in the long run. Tony, though, disgrades it. Saving Rachel comes first and orders Rhodes to stay put while he handles the situation. As Iron Man flies out, he realizes that he is being ushered into a trap but decides to go in anyway. He finds Rachel in a make-believe arcade and soon breaks her from the thrall. However, before they can escape, they're caught, and Mandarin uses his rings to transfer the duo somewhere they won't cause trouble. Meanwhile, he carries on his plan of exploding the Watchmen tanks to ensure enough chaos which would give him a leeway to take control. On the other hand, Iron Man and Rachel are in an underground tunnel, but Iron Man's suit is rapidly losing energy. Seeing the grim situation, Rachel snaps and says it's all her fault and selfishness that landed them here, and if she had gone to the piano lessons as she was supposed to, nothing would have happened. She sobs, but Iron Man promises that it is only Mandarin's fault. However, her sobs gave him an idea. Since all forms of energy are interchangeable at some level, he asked Rachel to use her portable music device to charge him up. Thus, as the power courses through him once again, Iron Man takes Rachel home before heading toward jeopardizing Mandarin's evil plan. As the dust settles, Iron Man says that Stark Enterprises will pay for all the damage and handle any other complications. Meanwhile, Rachel has finally started to appreciate classical music like never before. Episode 5, The Grim Reaper wears a Teflon coat. A war aircraft is heading straight for New York City. However, it is proving to be pretty indestructible to combat, as it has a force field protecting it from counterattacks. This, though, is simply a demonstration by Tony Stark to introduce his new prototype aircraft fighter bomber, the Grim Reaper, to the government. However, he is reluctant to give away Grim Reaper and proceeds to warn them that in the wrong hands, the fighter bomber would only spell out destruction. Nevertheless, the government is adamant about their contract, and Tony has to relent. Later, as Tony and Julia are video conferencing with Rhodes from Washington, Tony expresses his concerns once more. Meanwhile, Wanda wanders in and asks for a period of leave if they are not looking to employ her services for now. Julia, in her usual strut, goes on to have a quipping match with Wanda before she leaves on her vacation. Tony, though, is still wondering about the Grim Reaper, but Rhodes assures him that everything is going to be okay. Well, people say not to jinx the future by saying it's going to be okay, because no sooner did Rhodes assure Tony than Mandarin's henchman appeared on the scene. Grey Gargoyle turns the first few security personnel to stone to stop them from raising alarms. Then, the group donned their special time warp suit, which helped them sneak into the facility and steal the Grim Reaper right under their noses. However, the alarms blared and Rhodes quickly realized something was wrong, but he was too late to remedy the situation. The Grim Reaper was gone. Later, at a press conference, Justin Hammer is again trashing the reliability of Stark Enterprise. He accuses Stark of not being able to deliver the Grim Reaper on time, yet taking public funds for it. This obviously enraged the masses, and they started forming mobs and attacking the Stark Industries. Meanwhile, back at Mandarin's lair, Mandarin is praising Modok for his ingenuity in devising such a clever plan of distorting space and time. As a reward for his clever mind, Mandarin asks Modok to take the first spin on the Grim Reaper. Well, of course, Mandarin is very aware of the fact that Tony would have installed booby traps for any unauthorized piloting activity, but that shouldn't stop a genius, right? Thus, Modok climbs onto the pilot seat and takes out the Grim Reaper for a test run. However, as soon as he started piloting the bomber, the system ejected him since he was an unauthorized pilot. Meanwhile, Mandarin asks Justin to cause more public chaos for the Stark Enterprise. Tony Stark is having a really hard time figuring out what went wrong and how the Grim Reaper vanished, if vanished at all. This episode emphasizes the ethical dilemmas Tony faces when his technology is used for harm, a recurring theme in Iron Man stories. Anyhow, he wishes, much to Julia's annoyance, that Wanda was with them so that her hexing abilities would find some solid clue. Tony is running himself rugged, finding any scrap of evidence, when he is unduly attacked by a mob, but is saved by Rhodes, who drives the chaotic mob away. Meanwhile, Wanda, who was following the news, decided to cut her vacation short. Later on, as Tony is in a therapy session, both Julia and Wanda walk in, and Tony can sense a verbal match brewing. Thus, he simply says he doesn't have time for their antics when he realizes what exactly went wrong with the Grim Reaper. That's what they were looking for. Tony assembles the others and explains how Mandarin's henchmen distorted the space and time constraints to steal the fighter bomber. Once the answer was out, Tony quickly suited up in his Iron Man suit and headed to Mandarin's lair, accompanied by Spider-Woman, War Machine, and Hawkeye. While the latter two created a distraction, the former two barged into Mandarin's lair and confronted the villain. Sensing he was cornered, Mandarin quickly ran away, leaving the Grim Reaper behind. Tony then flew the fighter bomber to the government, but he felt something was amiss. He did a quick research and found out that he accidentally delivered the Grim Reaper into the hands of Mandarin's people. So, to avoid a catastrophe, he once again suited up in his Iron Man suit and stopped the fighter bomber before it attacked the heart of the US government. However, he was not keen on keeping the Grim Reaper, now that he knew how much trouble it could cause. Thus, he decided to sink it and return the money he received from the government as a show of good faith. Episode 6, Enemy Without, Enemy Within. On a bright, sunny day, James Rhodes and Wanda are taking Tony's new water strider for a test run. Unfortunately for them, they are attacked by a group of torpedoes and watercraft. However, Tony thinks it is the perfect opportunity to see what the water strider can do. Naturally, it defeated all the attackers and came out with flying colours. Meanwhile, at a beach called Sea Cove, an international model, Ilana is doing a summer photo shoot when Mandarin's henchmen attack them. The grey gargoyle turned two of them to stone while taking the model and the photographer as collateral hostage. However, Modok is surprisingly against harming the captives, which makes Mandarin genuinely suspicious. Can any evil grow a conscious mind? Thus, when Modok asked to be excused due to fatigue, Mandarin decided to secretly bug him and see where he was headed. Meanwhile, at the Stark Enterprise, the group is anticipating an attack from Mandarin when someone gets past their security and sneaks into their ammo room. When they go to check it out, it is none other than Modok. Shocking, isn't it? Anyhow, the group is almost ready to attack when Modok says something even more surprising. He wants sanctuary and help from them. Openly disbelieving, the group again takes up their positions to attack him. But Modok insists that this is no trap. To prove it, he is even ready to blow himself to bits and pieces alongside them. Eventually, Tony concedes to hear Modok out privately. Thus, Tony and Modok go to the room where Iron Man suits are lined up. Modok starts by begging for help, and Tony could sense that there is more to the story. Finally, seeing there is no other way round, Modok eventually agrees to tell a story to him, or rather, show Tony his true memory. The tale goes like this. Once upon a time, Modok was not the monster he is now, but rather a brilliant physicist who was working in the steppes of Central Asia. His work acquainted him with the KGB advancement of Secret Institute for the Advancement of Soviet Science, where his work gained the attention of the famous Red Ghost. It was only at the behest of Red Ghost that he agreed to be his test subject. However, it was back then that he fell in love with Ilana, unknowingly that Red Ghost was also in love with her. In an act of revenge, he turned Modok into a monster, and that changed the dynamic between him and his love. Thus, that is how Modok decided to work for Mandarin, because he is the only one who can change Modok back to his former self. Hearing the story, Tony agreed to help him, because he is nothing if not a soft touch at his heart. Meanwhile, Ilana refuses to simply await her impending doom and decides to bring help. However, she is caught in the act by Dreadnought and tied to a pole along with the photographer. Even then though, she is not ready to give up and eventually breaks free again. This time she comes across the true plan of Mandarin to shrink the water strider. On the strider, Wanda and Rhodes prepare to land on the beach when they suddenly feel that the thing is shrinking. However, thanks to Ilana, the effect is reversed, and Wanda and the War Machine along with the rest of the gang fight off Mandarin and his fellow men, and obviously return victorious. Later, when Tony returns, he informs Modok that they were successful in saving Ilana. Modok is naturally relieved to know that, but says he'll tell Mandarin he was forced to comply with Iron Man. To that, Tony replies, he'll do the same. Modok scoffs at Iron Man's soft heart. Episode 7, The Origin of the Mandarin. Another day, another attempt by the villainous Mandarin to steal away one of Tony Stark's inventions, Wild Cater. However, his plan was essentially botched by Iron Man himself, which forced the Mandarin to flee quickly. Much to the group's delight though, in his haste, Mandarin left behind a black box recorder that could hold a key to his evil plans, or so thinks the illustrious Iron Man. Thus, they take the box back to their lair, and there they realize it is some sort of hidden personal diary. However, before Tony and Wanda could feed their curiosity, Tony had other things to take care of. So he leaves Wanda, Sentry, and Spider-Woman in charge as he heads out. Once Iron Man is gone, Wanda tries to get into the diary. They discover that it is Mandarin's personal time capsule. The story begins and Mandarin takes us back in time to the deserted heart of Central Asia. It was a tumultuous region where there was madness and bloodlust for war. Mandarin back then was a mere archaeologist with the name Arnold Brock. However, his group was being targeted by a band of renegades, which made their survival risky out in the arid landscape. As they were waiting on their impending doom, Mandarin could not help but think that he was destined for more greatness. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted by his fiancée, who informed him that their friends would buy them time to escape when the renegades attacked them. You know what they say, evil can hardly resist temptation, and as it happens, for Mandarin, the chance to escape with his life proved more important than the woman he loved. He abandoned her and stole the only camel for himself. However, he was attacked by the renegades and ended up falling onto an archaeological site. There, he came across something extraordinary, an alien spaceship's power source. Greedy as ever, he touched it and gained immense power. He also came across 10 uniquely crafted gems. However, he was attacked by a bunch of mechanical dragons, but he refused to die miserably. Thus, he escaped and found that his group was annihilated along with his fiancée, but she left her jewels back. He took them and molded them into rings fitted with those gemstones from the cave. The mystical aspect of the rings was showcased in ways the comics hadn't yet fully explored at the time, blending science fiction and magic elements. As Mandarin's story was unfolding, the trio, Wanda, Julia, and Sentry, were captivated by it. Strange, no? Well, obviously, they're being hypnotized by none other than Hypnotia. This whole thing was Mandarin's plan to get into Stark's armory. Meanwhile, Iron Man and the other two realized something was wrong and tried to connect with the other three. However, without any response from them, Iron Man decided to head back, but they were derailed by Whirlwind. Back at the base, Mandarin finally has gained access to Stark's Hall of Armor and fitted himself with a suit. However, Iron Man, along with Hawkeye and War Machine, came rushing back and broke the hypnotizing spell on the other three. Together, they backed Mandarin's forces and cornered him. However, before departing, Mandarin promised that the fight was not over yet, and the only way it would ever be over was when the best man was left standing. Episode 8, The Defection of Hawkeye. Mandarin has again got his eyes on something of Tony Stark's this time, an overland tanker. His lackey, Modok, informed him that the tanker was carrying 1,000 gallons of some specialized alloy, which if they steal would be very beneficial. Meanwhile, Tony and Julia are following the overland tanker in Tony's car, where they discuss the possibility of an attack by Mandarin. True to their speculation, Mandarin attempts to steal the tanker. However, Tony and the others try to fend them off with much vigor. As the evil party is pumping the alloy out of the tanker, Iron Man and his group are facing a personnel shortage. Apparently, Hawkeye is elsewhere. This makes the group suspicious, but Tony vehemently refuses to believe that Hawkeye is a turncoat. However, they decided to head back because the time for their real delivery to the government was fast approaching. Meanwhile, Mandarin was successful in pumping out the alloy and escaping Tony's group. Back at his lair though, Mandarin is having second thoughts. he is doubting the ease of their little heist. And as it turns out, he was right. Iron Man wanted them to escape with the alloy because it was not the real cargo anyhow. Funny how they were tricked, ain't it? Next, at the armory, the atmosphere is tense with speculation as to how the Mandarin got information about their tanker. All of them, albeit Tony, believe they have a traitor amongst them, which is quite plausible since Hawkeye was MIA in the last mission. However, for Tony, that doesn't prove anything but plain tardiness on Hawkeye's part. At that moment, Hawkeye, aka Clint, returns and is questioned rigorously by the group. However, he refuses to relent about his whereabouts, claiming he was an adult and he did not owe them an explanation. This, though, made the group more susceptible to doubt his motives. Thus, Julia decided to tail Clint in Tony's car. However, as she was following him, Clint tried his best to throw her off his trail, making Julia even more suspicious. She followed him straight into the Hammer Hill, and by then, Julia had made up her mind about his loyalties. As Clint successfully threw her off her tail, he was hypnotized by hypnosia. Meanwhile, the group is getting ready for their delivery at midnight, but Clint is still not there. They decide that if Mandarin does show up to botch this real delivery, that means Clint has definitely defected. Back at his lair, Mandarin and Modok watch special magnetic bugs attach themselves to the tanker as it leaves, which would lead them straight to their target. And much to their amusement, Iron Man and his friends would only blame Hawkeye for the mishap. As for Hawkeye, he could do nothing but stand hypnotized in front of Justin Hammer as Mandarin and his lackeys attack the tanker. Justin gleefully says that Hawkeye has much to explain when he gets back. Meanwhile, Iron Man and the others save the real tanker from falling into the wrong hands at the very last moment. Back at the armory, Clint is back. However, he is surrounded by others who angrily question Clint about his whereabouts again. He is being accused of being a traitor, but he does not accept any of those claims by stating that he has no memory of what happened after he threw Julia off his trail. They show him some pictures, but he insists that those are fabricated. After much bickering, the group reveals that they do not think he has gone bad, but they do think it's suspicious that he won't tell them where he actually was. However, as everyone pressured him again, he was about to begin his story when Mandarin attacked. The evil master had thought that they'd be too busy hammering Hawkeye with questions to stop him. However, he was sorely mistaken, as Iron Man and his friends easily fought them off and prevented Mandarin from gaining the upper hand again. As the episode comes to an end, we see Clint bringing Julia, Tony and Rhodes to Hammer Hill, where he reveals the true reason for his absence. He was looking after his sick grandfather, of course. Episode 9, Iron Man to the Second Power, Part 1. At Mandarin's lair, Modok is testing out his new invention, a skeletal robot with enough power to meld other robots. He is pretty proud of his new invention and requests an audience in Mandarin to show it off. As Mandarin and the others gather around, Modok unveils his skeletal robot that has the skin of Iron Man. However, there is one crucial flaw in it, something that would easily be distinguishable. Enraged, Mandarin berates Modok, but he assures them that he has a plan. He has actually bugged one of Stark's facilities and would lure Iron Man. Modok uses the bug to trigger Stark's machines to go berserk and attack anyone present. However, Iron Man appears at the scene and saves the day. Unbeknownst to him, he gave Modok the exact opportunity to copy Iron Man's armor for his duplicate. As the clone version of Iron Man demonstrates its capabilities, Mandarin sends Hypnosia and the others to a village to capture it and take the villagers hostage. It is phase 1 of their Operation Darkwater Fever. Meanwhile, the fake Iron Man goes to meet Justin Hammer. According to the plan they fabricated, the Iron Man decoy would force its way into Justin Hammer's facility and steal the antidote for Darkwater Fever. Later, Justin convinces the government to notify that Stark is using his Iron Man to steal an antidote because he is planning to profit from the spread of the virus. However, his claims were dismissed easily by the members of the government. At the village, a much more chaotic environment is underfoot, as long as a quipping battle for Hypnosia's affection. Nevertheless, they report to Mandarin about the success of their mission, and he asks them to move to Phase 2. On the news channels, the news of Iron Man's activities is spreading like wildfire. His friends are having a hard time tracking down Tony, and they can't help but buy into the story. Not all of them, though. Meanwhile, a broadcast is being shown where Iron Man delivers an ultimatum. If he's not paid in gold by midnight, he'd release the deadly virus, and as a collateral of his claim, he would release the virus onto Los Angeles first. With this ominous cliffhanger, this episode comes to an end. Episode 10, Iron Man to the Second Power, Part 2. After the last episode's cryptic and threatening warning, Iron Man's friends are reeling to accept the reality. They cannot believe their friend would raise money in such an offhand way, but they can't deny it's his voice that is demanding the ransom. Thus, they decide to check for themselves about where Tony actually is. Rhodes asks Sentry to locate him using his powers, however. For some reason, he cannot. Thus, they decided to look for their friend in the old-fashioned way, searching hither and forth for him. Meanwhile, Mandarin's evil plan is right on track. At the village, the fake Iron Man brings in Justin and another foe, who contaminates the village's corn crop. With their evil plan in perfect sync, all that is left is for Iron Man to release the toxic virus. It doesn't matter to Mandarin whether they get the ransom amount or not. What means more to him is the chaos and destruction it would cause. On the other hand, the true Iron Man's friends are on a hunt to find him. However, Julia decided to take a detour. She goes back to the lab and prevents Wanda from being digitized. Julia then proposes that they should work together to find Tony by sneaking into his hall of armor and see which suits are missing. There's truly nothing more productive than an alliance between frenemies. They quickly understand which armor Tony took and they go out to find him. The two girls track Tony drilling underwater. However, before they can explain what is going on, one of Mandarin's henchmen attacks them. Nevertheless, they manage to escape the perilous waters, and once they're on dry land again, the girls give Tony a briefing on what is going on. Thus, Tony suits up in his Iron Man suit and heads straight for the jugular, stopping the duplicate Iron Man. While a little scuffle ensues between Mandarin's forces and Iron Man's allies, he himself goes on to attack the fake Iron Man. With much effort, he obviously comes out victorious and prevents the leak of a deadly virus. Another day, another of Mandarin's plans botched. Episode 11, The Origin of Iron Man, Part 1. The episode begins with Iron Man flying through the sky to check on their geothermal plant, which was issuing a signal of volcanic activity. However, as Tony approaches the area, he finds nothing is amiss, and he relays the information back to the group waiting for him in the armory. Rhodes and the others, though, are extremely worried about Tony flying out there alone. To that, Tony assures them that everything is just fine. Besides, he has IRVING with him. Julia still argues that a robot is no match for War Machine or Hawkeye, but Tony still declines their help. Meanwhile, Mandarin and Modok are watching Iron Man and rejoicing about the fact that he fell for their fake distraction. He then summons Fing Fang Fum to attack Iron Man, but the dragon refuses to be commanded by Mandarin without any beneficial offer for him. With no other choice left, Mandarin agrees to a bargain with him as long as he eliminates Iron Man. Then, Mandarin projects a fake hologram of Iron Man that asks his friends to give him a 1-hour window to do the checks, and then he tunes off. As Iron Man sets into a crater to check the issue, Mandarin sends a robot to attack him, and later, the dragon also takes a swipe at him. Iron Man barely escapes before he falls into a glacier with his suit very badly damaged. He removes his getup and asks for an overall check when he is told that it would take almost 6.5 hours for the suit to be properly fixed. An awfully long time, isn't it? Anyhow, being in a glacier made him long for the warmth of summer, and suddenly he has a flashback of his parents. He quickly snaps out of it, but the computer on his helmet tells him that it is better if he stays in a memory module, since it'll help keep him warm. The flashback starts, and we see Tony Stark's father, Walter Stark, complaining about Tony's lackadaisical nature and how he takes almost nothing seriously. His mother simply says that Tony is just a 17-year-old boy and he has plenty of time to grow up. The series was created during a time when the animation style was heavily influenced by Japanese anime, and that can be seen in the way young Tony looks here. His father scoffs and says at Tony's age, he already knew what responsibilities meant, and Tony should acknowledge them too. We then see a 17-year-old Tony Stark going through his teenage years without a care in the world. Once he turns old enough to work with his father, his carelessness causes Stark and Sons a crucial deal. The flashbacks are interrupted when Hypnotia and Dread Knight, who have been searching for Iron Man all along, get a lead that takes them to the glacier Tony was buried under. However, Tony quickly hides and saves himself from a confrontation with them. Later, the flashback continues, and we see Walter Stark getting himself critically injured during a routine check at one of their facilities. Courtesy of Justin Hammer, of course. Tony rushes to the hospital to his father, who says that he cannot expect Tony to love their business as much as Walter himself does. However, the present Tony could not disagree more. He laments his reckless youth youth, but he always wanted to follow in the footsteps of his father. In the flashback, without Walter Stark, Tony was forced to leave his youth behind and man up to take responsibility. He worked diligently for the Stark Enterprise when Justin Hammer again attacks Tony. He is then taken away to Mandarin, who orders Tony to create an invincible suit for world domination. Without any other alternative, Tony throws himself into doing Mandarin's bidding, but the progress is slow. It made Mandarin frustrated enough to lock Tony up with a coffin. Out of curiosity, when Tony opened the coffin, a man in a lion costume jumped out. That is when the alarm sounded again outside the memory module. The episode ends here, at a cliffhanger, obviously. Episode 12, The Origin of Iron Man Part 2. To begin where the last episode left us, Tony Stark's memory module was interrupted by a sudden alarm. However, we quickly return to his flashback where he fends off the attacks of the lion-costumed man. Tony promises that he means no harm, and the guy responds in kind by removing his mask. His name was Wellington Yinsing, the famous physicist. Yinsing befriends Tony, and the two are forced to work for the Mandarin. And to that, Tony assures them that everything is just fine. Besides, he has Irving with him. Julia still argues that a robot is no match for War Machine or Hawkeye, but Tony still declines their help. Meanwhile, back in the present, Tony's friends are worried sick about him. They soon realise that the video of Tony asking an hour to repair was fabricated, and the group decides it is time for them to meddle. On the other hand, Fin Fang Foom returns to Mandarin and demands that the time has come for him to keep his end of the bargain. Mandarin naturally refuses, stating that the deal was to finish off Iron Man, but he failed to do so, and now he is alive somewhere. Ever so cunning, Fin Fang Foom simply informs them that he'll complete his end of the bargain once he receives what was promised to him, the mechanical dragons Mandarin has. At first, Mandarin refuses, but seeing Fin Fang Foom's capability to destroy Iron Man, he relents and gives away the dragons. The three dragons fly off to supposedly finish Iron Man. Back at the Glacier Cave, Tony is still consumed by his memory module. With the help of Yinsing, Tony slowly invents a suit, but Justin Hammer scoffs at it. An enraged Mandarin says that if they do not deliver on their promise, both of them will be tortured, and with that, he leaves them to their dinner. As soon as the Mandarin leaves, Tony and Yinsing project a holographic image of them enjoying dinner to trick Mandarin into eavesdropping on them. Yinsing urges Tony to put on the suit and wait patiently until it integrates with his neurotic senses. He further tries to trick Mandarin by suggesting a decoy who will look like Tony Stark, so that the villains would mistake Tony Stark and Iron Man to be two different people. Meanwhile, back in reality, the helmet again issues a danger warning as the three dragons arrive. Tony, panicked, asked how long until the suit was completely ready, only to realise he still had 70 seconds to go. He decides to stay within the memory module for that duration. In the flashback, Mandarin barges in before Tony can properly fit into his suit, but is saved by Yinsing, who jumped in front of Tony to take the hit from Mandarin's rings. Iron Man manages to escape, but vows to never forget what went down that day. Now, as the memory jump is over, so is the recharging process of Iron Man's suit. Thus, he again gears up and heads out of the glacier, only to find his friends already engaged in a battle with Mandarin's henchmen. However, the lackeys are quickly defeated, but they come face to face with the dragons who breathe fire on them. Nevertheless, seeing how tedious the situation is, Fin Fang Foom decides that he is tired of the game and flies away from the scene with his fellow dragons. Episode 13, The Wedding of Iron Man. Wedding bells are in order, as Rhodes helps Tony with his tie before his nuptials. Yeah, very shocking indeed. Rhodes asks Tony for the umpteenth time if he is sure about it, and Tony replies in the affirmative. Thus, the two friends head off to the church for the ultimate event of the day. In front of the church, though, there is a huge crowd of people, along with reporters broadcasting Tony Stark and Julia Carpenter's wedding live. They are, after all, a billionaire couple. As Julia walks down the aisle, all the others who ever had a crush on Tony, like Wanda or Veronica, are in desperate tears. They are bawling their eyes out as they see Julia take up her spot beside Tony. The priest begins the ceremony, and Tony wonders how he ended up in the situation he was at the moment. His mind dials back to weeks prior when he and the gang were viewing old footage of their fights with Mandarin. Every time, Mandarin tends to show up somewhere super secretive, a place only someone from the inside would know. This made Tony suspicious, and he realized that they'd been bugged. Meanwhile, a mechanical raven flies out from their armory and returns to its owner, Modok. Mandarin reviews what the bird has heard this time, only to discover that their jig is almost up. Iron Man knows that they've been tracing him. Thus, Mandarin first destroys the Raven and asks Modok to pull out the videos of their face-offs with Iron Man to search for something, the true identity of the person who wears the suit. As it turns out, Tony Stark's group has figured out what was actually tracking their conversations. Meanwhile, Mandarin's forces figured out the true identity of Iron Man, Tony Stark. Thus, both sides devise a plan to catch the other. However, the flashback gets cut short and we're back at the church. The ceremony is almost over, and the newlyweds share a sweet kiss before taking off for their honeymoon. Unbeknownst to them, Mandarin and his lackeys are following the lovebirds, though they're not truly unaware as they had already anticipated Mandarin's motives. Julia alerts Clint about their pursuers, and an old woman immediately gears up in an Iron Man suit to trick the Mandarin. Back on the road, Mandarin has cornered the newlyweds and is about to deal the final blow when Iron Man enters the scene. Mandarin, baffled at how that is possible when Tony Stark is just in front of him, decides to hell with diplomatic attacks and orders his lackeys to fight Iron Man and his group. However, as the saying of good over evil goes, Iron Man and his friends quickly defeat Mandarin's goons, which forces them to flee rather quickly. As the dust settles, Wanda comes along and is equally baffled to find Tony and Iron Man together. It is at that moment the ultimate truth is revealed. The person under the suit and the old woman's outfit was actually the real Tony Stark, while the one whom Julia married was simply a decoy robot. Life is certainly an interesting game of cards, isn't it? Season 2, 1995 to 1996. Episode 14, The Beast Within. The episode begins with Iron Man getting sucked into a clever plan fabricated by none other than Justin Hammer. Unknowingly, he breaches Hammer's borders and launches a counterattack, which brings him in direct range for them to try something fishy. Soon enough, Tony is cornered by them and Hypnotia uses her powers to hold him still. However, Iron Man manages to escape, but not unscathed. Back at his armory, Homer relays the extent of his injury, but Tony is not eager to share the length of his pain with his friends. As Rhodes knocks on the door, Tony quickly hides his injury and acts as if everything is fine when Rhodes inquires about Tony's health. However, he did not only come as a concerned friend, but also to relay the message that Fury from S.H.I.E.L.D. is there, waiting for Tony in the conference room. With a sigh, Tony heads to meet Fury, who berates Tony for his recent activities. Fury also shows Tony a mysterious case. Several shady industrialists are missing, but somehow they have turned up in a remote valley within China. Curious, Tony decides to look into it. With some research, Homer and Tony unearth something unique, a collection of pictures of the 4 industrialists who are set apart by years in between them. However, interestingly, they all look the same. Smells fishy, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, this leads to Tony questioning the connection between a dragon, Fing Fang Foom, Mandarin, and the 4 industrialists. Later on, as Tony is boarding a plane to China, Rhodes insists on accompanying him. However, Tony refuses and instead asks Rhodes to post a package on behalf of him. Reluctantly, Rhodes lets Tony go, though he is still worried. He goes straight to the lab and asks Homer to give live updates on Tony Stark's aircraft. Meanwhile, Hypnotia and Blizzard are following the aircraft on a boat, and Hypnotia uses a bird to plant a bomb on Tony's aircraft. Back at the lab, Homer quickly informs War Machine about the bomb, who immediately flies out to save Tony, but arrives a second too late. The aircraft explodes in front of his eyes, and as he dives into the water after it, he only discovers pieces of Tony's suit. In a fit of rage, he attacks Hypnotia and Blizzard, but realizes how futile it is, so he heads back and meets up with the others. Then he heads straight for Justin Hammer, who insists he knows nothing but only that Mandarin has some important business in China. At a cave, Fing Fang Foom leads the 4 industrialists inside. There, Mandarin was waiting for them, who revealed that the industrialists were dragons in disguise and he could help them turn into dragons again, in exchange for complete obedience from their side. The dragons apparently agree, but no sooner did they turn into dragons than they betrayed the Mandarin. Meanwhile, a person wearing a long coat is accepting a package from the Beijing airport. Back at the cave, Mandarin is tricked, and now a gate is open through which dragons from Fing Fang Foom's planet can come through. Besides, Mandarin alone was powerless to stop the dragons. At that moment, War Machine arrives, trying to fight the dragons but is having a hard time landing a hit. Suddenly, Iron Man, totally alive and fully functional, comes out of nowhere and tries to fend off the dragons. However, he too was not powerful enough to stop them. That is when Mandarin suggested the idea of yin and yang. They both were different, and maybe their different powers together can work. Fortunately, they did, and the dragons were eliminated. Back at the lab, Tony gets a hard punch from Rhodes, who is mad at him for faking his death. The group too was disappointed in Tony, and they decided to dissolve their alliance, with the exception of Rhodes and Julia, of course. Somewhere back in a rural Chinese village, a doctor gets an emergency call for a patient. The Mandarin, of course. Episode 15, Fire and Rain. On this fine day, Julia is giving a demonstration of Stark Enterprises' new invention, the Goliath. Meanwhile, War Machine is out there, in the sky, when suddenly something goes awry, and Goliath aims at him. Julia, who is in a frenzy, tries to warn him off, but he is critically hit by a missile while escaping and drops into a river. Tony Stark quickly suits up and runs to his friend's aid when another missile is heading straight for him. He manages to deflect it and go after War Machine, who by now is having a bitter flashback about how someone named Joe also died by drowning in front of him. Later on, as Rhodes lies unconscious, Tony keeps a watch over him. Soon, James Rhodes comes back to his senses, and the duo is joined by Julia. They're informed by Homer that due to some human error, the malfunction must have happened, and the group decides to investigate. Meanwhile, as they're investigating, a message is broadcast on their computers. Someone named Firebrand is going to rain chaos at midnight. With their culprit in hand, Tony heads out in search of Firebrand. He comes across a power facility that is on fire and helps the workers trapped there, even though he himself gets caught in an explosion and drains most of his suit's energy. He soon gets a message that even the Stark Enterprise facility is on fire, and he quickly runs over there to save it. Back at the lab, Julia, Tony and Rhodes puzzle over who the Firebrand could be when they get their first clue. Someone named Simon Gilbert was once fired by Stark Enterprise. The man was genius, but greedy, and fell prey to it. Naturally, he must have hated him, and now his son is probably bent on revenge. Once Firebrand is identified, Tony suits up and head out, and even asks War Machine to do the same. Iron Man confronted the Firebrand, who despite his best efforts managed to trigger down a dam. However, Iron Man manages to stop the villain, and Firebrand falls into the water but is saved by Iron Man. Nevertheless, due to low energy, Iron Man himself got caught in the current and was almost swept away, but was saved by his friend, War Machine. As they flew back, War Machine lent his power source to Iron Man, who quickly charged the suit up. Then, the duo deftly stopped the water from ravaging the entire city. As the dust settles, Firebrand is arrested by the police, and Stark Enterprises' reputation is saved by Julia. However, it is then that Rhodes asks Tony to never call up War Machine again. He promises that he'll lend support to Tony as James Rhodes, but he won't take to the sky again. Somewhere else on a deserted land, a master is cracking his whip on his worker, and on his finger glints a gold ring. The worker is none other than Mandarin, who later steals the ring away, another added to his ring scavenger hunt. Episode 16, Cell of Iron. At Stark's laboratory, his futuristic computer, Homer is having a really hard time grasping the meaning of irony. Suddenly, Tony is being summoned by the shields, much to his dismay. He suits up and goes as Iron Man, but instead of receiving a warm reception, he is being pelted by ammunition. However, soon the welcome party is over, and S.H.I.E.L.D.'s agent arrives to tell Iron Man to just relax. He was not expecting Iron Man, that's all. Angrily, Iron Man demands his intentions about the damage he caused to Stark property, but the man replies it is no longer Stark's, but S.H.I.E.L.D.'s property by the decree of the US government. Shocked, Iron Man demands to know what is happening. The man tells him that very recently, on a tea plantation outside one of the Stark properties, a school was suddenly blown apart, killing innocent children. However, the agency thinks it's not due to some invention gone wrong at a Stark facility, but dirty work by Ames. This makes Iron Man angry that they're just sitting there doing nothing, but the agent says they're planning to go into space in 2 hours to check things out. Iron Man simply says they're 1 hour 59 minutes too slow and takes off, despite warnings from Homer that his new suit is not properly tested. In space, Iron Man comes across a strange space station, but before he can do anything, he is caught in a meteor shower. However, just before the biggest piece could hit him, a man who calls him the Centurion arrives and warns him off the space station, Starwell. Undeterred about the warning, Iron Man sneaks onto the space station and comes across various markings of AIMS. Soon, as he delves deeper into the space station, he finds a man named Arnold Dearborn. He has been living in the space station all alone. All this time, Dearborn decides to show Iron Man around and tells him about the harnessing solar energy to generate the ultimate source of power. This rings a bell for Iron Man, and he connects the dots soon enough. This ultimate energy power was what hit the school in China. When Iron Man mentions that to Dearborn, he admits it might be true, but it wasn't intentional, but merely an accident. Enraged, Iron Man accuses Dearborn of being in cahoots with Ames, but Arnold insists that he isn't. He just took help from them to build the space station and was recommended to do so by Justin Hammer. More annoyed than frustrated about the gullible man, Iron Man goes out to do a perimeter check when he is attacked by Ames's scouting craft. With some difficulty, he manages to drive them off, but loses consciousness in the process. Next, when he wakes up, he is strapped to a table by Dearborn, who refuses to let him leave. Seeing no other way, he asks Homer to help, and he reluctantly obliges. Once he is free, he shoots out at the space station from within, which brings Dearborn running back. He asks Iron Man to stop destroying his life's work, but Iron Man simply states that if he doesn't put an end to Starwell, Ames is bound to take it away from him and cause immense chaos back on Earth. Even then, Dearborn is persistent in saving his ship, but a group of Ames attacking lackeys forces them to move out and fend them off. In the process, Starwell is critically hit and is falling at a tremendous speed, and the latitude of its crash is New York City. However, at the very last moment, Dearborn realizes his mistake and gives up his own life to protect innocent lives. The episode ends with a lesson that not every irony is amusing. Sometimes it is quite heartbreaking. Meanwhile, elsewhere on a cold, mountainous peak, Mandarin steals another of his rings. Episode 17. Not far from the tree, an old man is begging for help when a duo of robots show up. Meanwhile, Iron Man is flying about, working under orders of the S.H.I.E.L.D. agency. Nick Fury is adamant on Iron Man to not engage until they give him the green light. However, that is when the video of the old man asking for help starts up, sending a wave of recognition among the receivers. It is none other than Walter Stark, Tony Stark's father. Naturally, now Iron Man needs no further prompts to go vigilante. He dives straight into the facility, despite Fury's orders to not engage. Iron Man disables several robots and finally rescues the man, Walter Stark. Meanwhile, once Iron Man is gone working on his own, Rhodes does the same, much to Fury's annoyance. After destroying the facility, Iron Man carries Walter Stark onto an aircraft manned by Rhodes and straight into a hospital. Meanwhile, a round table of mysterious men discuss the completion of bugging S.H.I.E.L.D.'s computers, while also issuing orders to move on to Phase 2 of their plan. They task someone called Crimson Dynamo with it. Back at the hospital, Tony visits Walter, but doesn't believe it is his father who died 10 years ago. His suspicions grow as his father tells him that he doesn't remember much of the past as it is. Later, when he meets with Fury, they share a few terse words, but are interrupted by Walter again, who apparently had a panic attack seeing Fury. Thus, Tony decides to do a background check on this man, with whom even his DNA matches. Sometime later, Tony finds his father talking with Homer, who claims that his memory is still murky, but he remembers little tidbits from Tony's childhood. However, it soon turns into a screaming match, classic father-son bonding, when they're interrupted by Homer. He tells them that the S.H.I.E.L.D.s had exchanged Walter for an Ames agent all those years ago. Shocked, they also learn that they're being attacked by some unauthorized person. It was during the wild goose chase with the S.H.I.E.L.D.s that Fury tells Iron Man the truth. However, it is at that moment he receives a report stating Homer has locked the security out and his father is still there somewhere. As Iron Man goes to the rescue, so do Rhodes and Fury. However, as Tony finally accepts and hugs his father, it is revealed that he is not his father at all, but a clone with Walter Stark's brain and body. Enraged, Tony breaks free before he is also cloned by the fake Walter Stark and breaks out. Even though the mission failed, the clone version of Walter Stark believes that Tony Stark is still vulnerable and soft for his father, and someday he will use that to bring Tony Stark down. Elsewhere, a thief is being threatened to give up the ring he is carrying, to Mandarin, of course, who is collecting his scattered rings one by one. Episode 18, Beauty Knows No Pain. This episode begins in Cairo, the land of pharaohs. A construction crew is digging a subway tunnel nearby, and Julia Carpenter is there to oversee things. According to the head construction worker, they're 3 days ahead of the schedule, which pleases Julia. However, suddenly the tunnel begins to shake mightily, which is strange because they're digging under solid rock, so there shouldn't be any cave-in. Nevertheless, they are about to be buried in rubble. And before that happens, Julia gears up in Spider-Woman costume and saves the workers. However, she herself falls through a crack in the ground while trying to save one of the workers. The news of Julia's disappearance reaches Tony and Rhodes, and they come to Egypt to search for her. Tony bravely decides to go into the crack through which Julia fell. However, when he asks Rhodes to suit up as War Machine, he vehemently refuses. Anyway, Tony goes in, and soon, Rhodes loses contact with him. Later on, Tony is ambushed by one of his old acquaintances, Whitney, who now goes by the nickname of Madame Mask. She wants Tony to find the mythical Eye of Isis, which is said to cure anything, even the hideous nature of her face that forces her to wear a mask. Tony, naturally, refuses at first, but Whitney says she has the right incentive to motivate him. She takes him to Julia, who is being put under great duress and pain by Whitney. Seeing Julia like that, Tony agrees to go on with the scheme. However, he wants a couple of moments alone with Julia. It is then that Julia inquires about Whitney, and Tony admits they shared a close personal relationship once. Later on, Tony delivers on his promise and suits up in the Iron Man suit to look for the Eye of Isis. However, it is a piece of common knowledge that ancient Egyptian tombs of temples have a horde of booby traps, and this one is no different. In search of the Eye of Isis, Tony comes across various traps and narrowly escapes many, before finally finding the crown containing the gem, aka Eye of Isis, and makes out of the underground passage before it completely collapses. Meanwhile, Julia, in her Spider-Woman costume, urges Rhodes to gear up as War Machine for the sake of Tony. After much bickering, he relents, and the duo goes in search of Tony. Back in Cairo, Whitney is ecstatic to get her hands on the diadem that will restore her face to normal. Once she gets it back, she urges Tony to be with her once again. However, Tony refuses, saying she loved his enterprise far more than she ever loved him. Suddenly, she realizes they're under attack and tries to take a swipe at Tony, but ends up somehow looking like the Egyptian goddess Isis. She punches a hole in the tunnel and flies out, causing chaos and rampage on her way. The trio of heroes goes after her, intending to stop her, but she comes out overwhelmingly strong. However, Tony manages to sneak past her defenses by bringing up their past and suddenly flings the diadem away from her. Whitney then returns to her usual self, but now her face is back to the hideous one. She laments that Tony can't even look at her face, but Tony reaches down and plants a soft kiss before telling her that she lost her inner beauty way before she lost her face. The episode ends with Mandarin gaining another of his ring on one side and Tony and Julia sharing a moment on the other. Episode 19, Iron Man on the Inside. An overworked Tony Stark stares at his computer. Funnily, the computer himself, Homer, tells him to do some regenerative activity, aka in plain simple words, sleep. However, at that moment Julia walks in and informs Tony that he has a conference in half an hour, so his nap time is over. However, Julia's reception towards Tony is a bit cold. Something catches Julia's attention, a plant under a certain device. Tony says it is a molecular expander, which would make the production of food way easier. As the duo heads out, they come across Hawkeye, who is also giving Tony a cold shoulder. However, before the situation can escalate, Julia stops them and heads out to the conference with Tony in tow. Surprisingly, Julia offered to pilot the aircraft, but no sooner did she take off than the duo was attacked by none other than Ultimo. Tony suits up as Iron Man to fend it off, while Hawkeye also jumps into the fray. Though, to be clear, he is not doing it for Tony. Anyhow, after a little scuffle, they did manage to get Ultimo down, but Hawkeye ended up incurring a serious spinal injury. However, there's still a red glow in Ultimo's eyes. The scene cuts to where Hawkeye is being examined by Homer, who informs Julia and Tony that the injury has an overwhelming chance of either rendering Clint dead or immobile. Not liking either of the possibilities, Tony blames himself and refuses to just sit by. He proposes that they use a neurochip that could help Clint, but Homer says any surgery to the spinal cord could spell out immediate death for Hawkeye. However, as it turns out, Tony's brainstorming abilities are infinite, and he proposes to shrink himself to molecular size to sneak inside Hawkeye's body and plant the neurochip that way. Meanwhile, an eccentric boy, nicknaming himself the Hacker, is trying to mess with Homer and succeeds. Back at the lab, Tony shrinks himself and is ready to be injected into Hawkeye's body. As he traverses through Clint's bloodstream, he realizes the blood flow is too swift and he is swept away into his heart. Tony almost gave Clint a heart attack for real. Nevertheless, he moves on, reaching his liver. There, his suit begins to dissolve and changes into a lava suit that can withstand the acidity of the liver. On the other hand, Homer is going berserk, thanks to the eccentric Hacker, who then asks Homer to affect Stark Enterprises' security systems. At first, Homer does not comply, questioning the command, but eventually he does, which allows Ultimo to enter their lab. Meanwhile, Tony has reached the site of injury on Clint's spine and planted the chip there, but it is at that moment Homer mentions that Tony has only 9 minutes to get out. Julia obviously freaks out and urges Tony to wrap things out a little faster. However, suddenly Ultimo appears inside Clint after Tony, creating a ruckus. It is then Tony realizes someone is controlling Ultimo, and that person is also toying with Homer too. Tony fends off Ultimo and blocks out the Hacker, but his time limit is running out. He has approximately 2 minutes to get out, and he devises a plan. Tony plans to head back to Clint's lungs and asks Julia to sprinkle some pepper on him. Naturally, Clint sneezed out Tony and Ultimo. Ingenious, right? Well, as soon as he was out, he was placed under the molecular expander again to revert him back to his original size. Julia, obviously overjoyed, runs over and kisses Tony, but their game isn't over yet. The red glow returns to Ultimo's eyes, and he attacks, but Tony has no strength to fight on. So, Spider-Woman takes center stage and is ultimately helped by Hawkeye. Later, they trace the location of the eccentric Hacker, and it turns out to be a mere college student who was consumed by his grudge of being rejected. Pretty childish, really. However, even though Clint is still giving Tony a cold shoulder, he does thank him for saving his life. The episode ends with an auction. A ring is being sold off, and 2 bidders try to outbid each other. However, the person who ends up getting the ring soon finds himself being attacked by the other auctioneer, the Mandarin. He takes the ring and walks off, ominously. Episode 20, Distant Boundaries. This episode begins with Tony undertaking rigorous exercises to check most of his suit units when Rhodes walks in. They're suddenly informed that some large extraterrestrial spaceship is headed for Earth. Specifically, it is expected to crash in Los Angeles, Malibu, within the upcoming 14 minutes. Thus, without wasting any more time, Tony suits up in his Iron Man suit and flies out into the space. However, his suit is not up to the snuff and gives out, causing Iron Man to lose balance and tumble onto Earth. Fortunately though, James Rhodes is always there to pick our beloved hero up. Later, Tony and Julia inspect the spaceship only to find a cryptic message, a monarch from a distant planet asking for Iron Man's help to fend off one of his old foes, Dark Aegis. Thinking back, Tony recounts his encounter with the villain and feels it's his responsibility to save the other planet. However, Julia tries to tell Tony that he cannot carry every burden alone. After all, no man is an island, no? Nevertheless, Homer informs them that within 2 hours the ship will go back to its home planet. Thus, despite Julia's words, Tony decides to board the ship to help those victims of Dark Aegis. As Iron Man prepares to board the spaceship, War Machine aka James Rhodes also arrives, wanting to ride shotgun. Friends don't let friends fly off into space alone, apparently. Anyhow, as the duo finally mount the spaceship to take off, Julia informs them of an intruder on the ship. However, before they can abort the mission, or do anything really, the spaceship takes off and Julia loses all contact with them. Once the spaceship is in outer space, Iron Man and War Machine go on a search to find out who the intruder on the ship is. It is then they came across Titanium Man, one of the many foes they fought. The duo tries to fight him off, but they end up landing on a remote planet with their ship in tatters. However, the duo tried to put on their brave faces and decided to make the best of the situation so that they could go home. Unfortunately, Iron Man came across Dark Aegis, who was desperately trying to recruit Iron Man on his side. And on the other hand, War Machine encountered Titanium Man. However, Titanium Man does not agree with Dark Aegis's philosophy and decides to join Iron Man and War Machine against the Maniac. Together, they landed a critical hit, but Aegis tried to escape by boarding an airship. But when Iron Man was about to go after him, Titanium Man took it upon himself to stop Aegis and redeem himself from his past deeds. Thus, thanks to T-Man, the duo could return to Earth, where Julia was overwhelmingly happy to see Tony. Meanwhile, even Rhodes decided to mend his armor once again and take up the mantle of War Machine for good. In some other place in the world, though, Mandarin gained another of his rings back, slowly biding his time until he had it all. Episode 21, The Armor Wars, Part 1. On this very fine day, Iron Man is on a mission to combat one of his old foes, Crimson Dynamo. He is hell-bent on creating a workers' paradise, and for it is even willing to sacrifice himself. However, this story is not about this vigilante, but a different one. As Crimson Dynamo explodes with his own missile, it scatters radiation for miles on Russian ground. This, however, is portrayed differently on the news. Apparently, for them, the destruction is the direct result of Iron Man's recklessness. As Tony watches the news, Nick Fury, one of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s agents, walks in and asks Tony to look into the new tricks Crimson Dynamo was up to. Thus, Tony does his customary research, only to unearth some shocking statistics. It is one of Stark's own designs that Crimson Dynamo used to wreak havoc in Russia. Unfortunately, Tony, who insists on taking the burden of the world on his shoulders, blames himself for all the lives lost and loses perspective of what is right and what is wrong. He asks Homer to take out a list of all the armored men in the vicinity, and he goes after them, neutralizing their armor one by one. However, his crusade soon loses its original objective, and in his desire to disable all armor, he even goes on disabling the Federal side, aka the good side. Eventually, the news broadcasts start to paint Iron Man as a vigilante who has completely disregarded public safety. His friends Julia and Rhodes are worried sick about him, but Tony insists on keeping them away from his vendetta. This arc included a deeper exploration of Tony's moral struggles, making it a standout storyline of the series. Meanwhile, Justin Hammer chuckles ominously and dreams about the fall of Stark Enterprises. His accomplice, an incorporeal ghost, who came up with the plan, warns Justin to be aware and leaves with his promised share of cash. On the other hand, Iron Man once again makes an error of judgment and breaks into a high-end security prison. However, he finds formidable resistance there, from none other than Hawkeye, but eventually overbears and disables the armor. This naturally enrages Nick Fury, who barges into Stark's office and demands that he cut off Iron Man, or the Stark Enterprises will suffer a serious blow. With no other way out, Tony simply calls a press conference to sever ties with Iron Man to save his company. Surprisingly, he never considered backing down from his purge of armor. Later that night, as Tony is in his beach house, Julia calls him out on the balcony and urges him to listen to reason. However, he again blocks her efforts out because he feels he cannot involve her in this at all. Julia is left standing on the cold, hard beach, lamenting. Episode 22, The Armor Wars Part 2. Julia has trashed the entire lab in a fit of rage after the last episode's events. As she sits with her head in her hands, Rhodes walks in and proposes it is time to involve their hard drive friend, Homer. At first, Homer is hesitant to sell out Stark, but with the correct nudge, he replies that even he feels Stark's judgment is a little off-kilter recently. He also informs that Iron Man is now heading south to attack Stingray. Frustrated at his antics, Julia suggests that War Machine goes after Iron Man to stop him. Reluctantly, Rhodes suits up and goes to find Iron Man, who has already defeated and destabilized Stingray. Tony says he doesn't want to fight War Machine, but sees no choice but to destabilize his armor too. Meanwhile, Justin Hammer unveiled his new invention, Firepower, to take down Iron Man. Taking the bait, Iron Man flies over to eliminate the new invention, no matter how much Julia insists Tony leave it. However, Iron Man's destabilizing trick did not work on Firepower, as it was programmed to resist it. Eventually, the new invention blew Iron Man to bits while Julia sat there on the computer. and watched the man she cared about die. Later on, Fury finds parts of Iron Man's armor and berates a group of soldiers who were recklessly playing with it. Back at the lab, as Homer tries to console Julia though, Tony surprisingly checks in through the intercom. He tells them that he did not die, Iron Man did. Later, when he is on the medical table and Homer lists out Tony's set of injuries, Tony admits that he had been short-sighted. In his desire to correct his shortcomings, he created more problems than necessary. Now, Iron Man is gone for good. However, his set of misfortune did not end with his confession. In the days to come, Justin Hammer uses firepower to attack every Stark Enterprise property and trash its credibility. One evening, as Tony is leaving his office, Nick Fury walks up to him and indirectly urges him to bring back Iron Man before Stark Enterprise is wiped out of the industrialist biz. Tony takes the advice to heart and locks himself up in his armory, creating a new version of Iron Man. Thus, in the end, he was easily able to defeat Firepower and trace the string of events back to Justin Hammer. When he finds the old industrialist, he tells him that he has simply inserted a virus that would wipe away all information about the suits and technology Stark has created, and as a bonus, much to Justin Hammer's detriment, the virus even wiped out Hammer Industries' entire database, rendering them bankrupt. The episode ends with Mandarin visiting a pawn shop and threatening its owner to give up another of his rings in exchange for letting the man live. Episode 23, Empowered. Well, haven't you been wondering what actually happened to Mandarin's lackey Modok? It has been really long since he made an appearance. As it happens, he is also after Mandarin's rings in order to empower himself. Typical, really. Anyhow, as Modok is trying to gather the rings, he is interrupted by Iron Man. However, he outmaneuvers him and escapes with one single ring. Nevertheless, he realizes that Mandarin has almost collected 7 of his rings by now, but he refuses to let Mandarin win. But as it turns out, Mandarin is an evil mastermind for a reason, and he easily locates the destination of the 8th ring to Modok and comes for it. Meanwhile, Iron Man laments his short-sightedness about not thinking about Mandarin's rings, is angry with himself for his defeat from Modok, and decides to find him once again. On the other hand, Mandarin watches a recap of everything Iron Man has been up to ever since he was too busy with recollecting his rings. He sees Iron Man fend off several foes with more ability than ever before. However, he knows that even the strongest of superheroes can have an Achilles heel, and he is intrigued as to what it is. He reviews many of Iron Man's recent scuffles, from his run-in with Whitney, then to his face-off with Firebrand, and even his little jaunt through space. Mandarin faces an amazing revelation. Iron Man's suit does have some technical issues. However, he still thinks he is missing something and reviews the fights again. This time, he notices that Iron Man has a tendency to do everything alone, much to his comrades' dissatisfaction. It has even led to the dissolution of Iron Man's little clique. Funny how Iron Man wears a suit of armor around him and keeps his heart encased in iron too. The episode comes to an end with Mandarin vowing his revenge on Mandarin. He says it is written in the stars. Episode 24. Hulkbuster. Before we start, it is intriguing to note that Iron Man was part of a shared Marvel Action Hour and even included guest appearances from other characters, like the aforementioned Captain America, or like today, the Incredible Hulk. An interesting crossover day indeed. On an expanse of desert, Julia, Tony and Rhodes are keeping a watch on Dr. Bruce Banner from a distance as he goes on with his work. However, nothing is as easy as that, and soon, mysterious beams hit Banner first, then course towards where the trio are. Julia ends up getting hit by the white beam and vanishing into thin air. Distraught, Tony, now in Iron Man's suit, pulls Bruce from harm's way and obliterates the source of the white beam, one of the rings of Mandarin. Meanwhile, an ominous green figure is watching the events unfold from a nearby cliff but sends his mechanical bugs just as Iron Man gets his hand on the ring. Bruce Banner informs Iron Man that there is a shift within the ring, much like time pockets. Iron Man realizes that he can use the ring's power to bring Julia back to him. Later, as they're flying on an aircraft, Bruce tells Rhodes and Tony about the eccentric green figure. He was once an assistant of Bruce Banner, but was hit by large proportions of gamma rays, changing him into the monster he is now. The man goes by the moniker of the Leader nowadays. However, their conversation is interrupted as stress makes Banner change into the Hulk and jump out of the aircraft. The Incredible Hulk is headed towards the laboratory of the Leader, who is rejoicing and daydreaming about using the rings to go back in time and get Hulk's power. In reality, the Hulk comes smashing in, destroys the lab, and takes away the rings with him. He wants to eliminate the rings because they're a threat to him, but Iron Man stops him before he can do so. After all, it is the only way to bring back Julia. They tumble on the ground and accidentally teleport back to ancient times. The Leader, dismayed that he has only one ring left, is being pushed by James Rhodes to bring his friends back. Seeing an opportunity for a bargain, he agrees. However, initially, they were having a hard time tracking not only Hulk and Iron Man, but also Julia. Meanwhile, back in ancient times, Hulk and Iron Man are still trying to get the upper hand when Hulk throws the ring into a volcano. Nevertheless, Iron Man jumps after it, changing into a more appropriate suit, and saves the ring. He urges Hulk to believe him, that he only needs the ring to save a lady. At first, Hulk believes Iron Man, but as they stumble through time again, he refuses to believe Iron Man's words. However, this time, they're in the same time period as Julia, but before Iron Man can save her, he is stopped by Hulk again, and they are both pulled through time again. Meanwhile, in the present, Rhodes and Homer keep a tight leash on the Leader, and eventually, they find Julia hanging from a cliff. Rhodes orders the Leader to save her, but just before she can paraglide inside, the portal changes time, and she is transported back when Bruce Banner became Hulk, as the Leader had hoped. On the other hand, the Hulk and Iron Man also land in that time period, and Iron Man suggests saving Bruce Banner. However, Hulk is not thrilled about the idea and stops him, but they also have to contend with the Leader. However, Rhodes has miraculously sent Iron Man another of his suits, Hulkbuster. Tony designs the Hulkbuster armor for the first time in animated form, a direct nod to its comic book counterpart. In an interesting turn of events, the Leader's ambitions were botched, but they were unable to prevent the tragedy that gave birth to the Incredible Hulk. As the dust settles, the group stumbles back to present times, and Hulk changes back into his mild genius alter ego, Bruce Banner. They both decide that they can keep a secret. Later on, Julia and Tony share a sweet kiss. The episode ends with the Mandarin finally obtaining all of his rings back, and now he's back on track to bring down Iron Man. Episode 25, Hands of the Mandarin, Part 1. The episode begins with Mandarin gatecrashing the UN Security Council meeting and demanding complete obedience from them. Naturally, they disagreed, which only gave Mandarin an excuse to bring the disaster to the doors of New York City. He held the entire city hostage under an anti-tech trap, causing power shortages everywhere. Meanwhile, our beloved hero Iron Man goes straight into the city without the knowledge that his technical suit won't be of any use to him once he enters the anti-tech area. Back at the lab, Julia is worried sick about it, since Homer informed her that without an energy source, Tony cannot survive more than 2 hours. She immediately contacted War Machine, who was on his way to NYC, that they needed non-technical backup. Who do you think fits that description? That's right, it is Hawkeye. As War Machine goes in search of Hawkeye, he gives Rhodes the cold shoulder, but eventually comes around to help when he learns Mandarin is involved in this messy show. Flying an aircraft, Hawkeye accurately pinpoints the location of Iron Man and rescues him. Even though he says once the crisis is over, so is their temporary partnership. Meanwhile, Mandarin's ploy of cutting off the power lines of the entire city was just a decoy for his bigger plans. He wanted to attack Hong Kong. He sends his lackeys there, who indiscriminately wreak havoc within Hong Kong. Iron Man and his fellow superheroes are left with no choice but to head to China to stop them. As Iron Man and War Machine fight off Blizzard and Whirlwind, they're overwhelmed by Hypnotia, but Hawkeye and Sentry easily save them. Sentry informs the group that Mandarin has a dark crystal that can generate an anti-tech field. Pretty scary for people who rely on nothing but tech help. Anyhow, now Mandarin is back at his lair, and he planning on something truly big. He intends to engulf the whole of China in an anti-tech field and take control. However, this alarms Modok, who survives on technical support, but Mandarin promises he'll be spared if he brings Iron Man to him. Fortunately, Modok did not have to go far, as at that moment, Iron Man barged in, alone with the intention to stop the Mandarin. However, the Mandarin has the power of the 10 gems and the Dark Crystal. He easily overbears Iron Man and rips his helmet off to reveal Tony Stark within. He thinks it's not surprising at all, but rather very logical that it would turn out this way. Nevertheless, he needs more power to charge up his Dark Crystal, and he lures Iron Man's friends in with a fake bait. The episode comes to a sudden end with the aircraft bearing Julia and the others coming hurtling down from the sky. Episode 26. Hands of the Mandarin, Part 2. To pick up where we left off, Iron Man's crew is falling through the sky and crash landing on the parapets of Mandarin's lair. They get a not-so-welcome reception from Mandarin's lackeys and end up being separated from James Rhodes. The others fall through and land exactly where Mandarin wanted them to be. He straps each of them to harness their life source and feed it to the Dark Crystal. Meanwhile, Tony watches helplessly, but suddenly he sees Rhodes beckoning him. James comes over and helps Tony out of his shackles, and they try to escape, but Modok finds them first. Tony beseeches Modok about how Mandarin does not care about him. If he helps them escape, they'll eliminate the anti-tech field. At first, Modok is hesitant, but then thinks better of it and decides to help the duo escape. However, as they say, trouble comes in pairs, and as they try to reach the Hong Kong headquarters of Stark Enterprise, they're attacked by bandits. Fortunately, War Machine saves them, but once they reach the lab, the Doctor is having a hard time rejuvenating Iron Man. Meanwhile, Mandarin noticed the absence of Tony Stark, and he extended his anti-tech field throughout Hong Kong, cutting off all sources of power. At the hospital, Tony is being treated, and things go berserk due to the power grid mishap, but the heat from the resulting explosion gives Iron Man's suit enough power to recharge. Meanwhile, at Mandarin's lair, he even used his own lackey's life force to spread the anti-tech field all over the world. But before things could escalate, Iron Man barges in and puts up a great fight. This time though, he openly admits requiring help from Hawkeye first, and Wanda later. Together, they destroy the Dark Crystal and many of Mandarin's rings. However, the villain is far from defeated. He dons on an exoframe, pure hypocrisy on the part of someone who is just tampering with the tech field, to fight the Iron Man. Nevertheless, heroes are heroes for a reason, and Iron Man eventually outwits the Mandarin and puts an end to his evil schemes once and for all. As the dust settles, Tony realizes he cannot fight everything alone, and sometimes teamwork goes a long way. The episode ends with a kiss between Julia and the illustrious Iron Man. The finale was praised for its ambitious animation, particularly the fight scenes, which were among the series' most detailed. We've finally reached the finish line. To be honest, Iron Man had a more subdued period of fame with this cartoon series before he became a pop cultural powerhouse in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. While the show portrayed Tony Stark and his companions as they fought stubborn adversaries, there were both good and bad aspects to its fandom reception. Primarily, it received acclaim from fans for its daring storytelling, especially in its second season, which included better animation, darker stories, and more mature topics. However, it garnered its fair share of criticism too, with its cliched plots and lackluster animation. In fact, the first season was often criticized for being too campy and lacking the sophistication that fans anticipated from a Marvel production. Fans nonetheless have a sentimental view of it despite its erratic tone and quality over seasons, and when the MCU adapts the character for live action, it just makes us adore Iron Man even more.